Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In this video, we're taking a quick look at the Innioasis Y1. This is an MP3 player or DAP digital audio player that has a couple of interesting secrets. One of them is it's actually running on Android, and that's partially revealed by some of the animations and folders that pop up, as well as when turning the device on and off, you see some of the animation prompts. And so the irony is, despite looking like a retro music player from the 2000s, it technically has the guts now of something like a basic or entry-level smartphone on the inside, just put into the chassis of a music player. The second fascinating point is this one actually has a real capacitive scroll wheel, similar to the iPods that it's perhaps inspired by. So you're able to just slide your fingers along to scroll up and down through lists, making navigation feel a little bit more intuitive. To me at least, it's quite nostalgic because many of these, which became popular 5 to 10 years ago, were also inspired by the Apple aesthetic, but there was no functioning touchpad or scroll wheel at all. Instead, the entire thing was just a piece of plastic that you had to press down on really hard in order to navigate through the menus, and actually pressing on OK didn't do anything. Sometimes you had to press on the menu key for some reason to enter it. It was just kind of a bizarre mess, to be completely honest. This Y1 actually now has a real functioning, again, touchpad on the front. And then the third secret of this player is it actually supports Rockbox, which is a operating system based on Linux, which was popular in the ROMing community back when iPods were still a thing. I didn't realize that this operating system actually continues to exist to this day, and you can find tutorials online for downloading a version which is compatible with this Y1 because, again, it's technically running on Android with an ARM-based processor. So if you want to further customize the skin as well as the way it looks, if you played around with the software back in the day, there's, again, hundreds of different skins from different community members that you can apply and push over to change the look, like this one inspired by Windows 95 in terms of the icon pack and all of the animations here, kind of reminding me of some of the retro gaming consoles that we've seen as well, which is pretty fun. So from running on Android to supporting additional customization of themes and launchers to having a real functioning scroll wheel like the actual iPod, this feels like a pretty convincing modern iPod equivalent, I have to say, since obviously Apple doesn't make these dedicated music players anymore. Which brings us to the point, why would you consider something like this in this day and age? Some reasons would include more modern components, including standard USB Type-C, the drag and drop experience. You can treat it just like a memory stick or an SD card for transferring music files over to this thing, compared to 30-pin connector. You have to use a specialized cable, have to use it with iTunes software, and perhaps more importantly, because many of these iPod classics, videos, and photos of the world are now approaching 10 to 20 years old, the battery life has largely degraded in many of these used systems, or even unused units that have been sitting on the shelf for years. And so as a result, the moment that we kind of unplug it from power, many of these won't really last as long, and they will kind of immediately start to power off, versus something like this, obviously produced in 2025, has a much newer battery inside. Now, of course, you can get spare replacement battery packs for iPods, but just requires a little bit more effort in terms of disassembling it and repairing some of the parts inside, which is perfectly fine as well. But if you want something that's ready to go out of the box, and you're more of a kind of casual consumer, and that's where perhaps something like this might be a little more hassle-free, even if it still isn't quite as premium as a real authentic iPod. Another aspect that's nice on this player is it does have built-in Bluetooth as a backup to the 3.5mm headphone jack on the bottom. So if you want to use them with wireless headphones, including AirPods, TWS-style buds, it is going to be supported on here compared to the actual iPod classics and videos of the past, including Nanos, did not support built-in Bluetooth. So those were wired-only players. If you want the added wireless convenience here, it might be something to consider. Granted, if you are an audiophile, some would argue that the best performance in terms of music quality can still come from the standard headphone jack, getting you closer to lossless quality if you're pairing it with a high-res recording like FLAC. Versus Bluetooth is inherently going to be more of a lossy signal that has a more compression going on when transmitted wirelessly. So this Innioasis Y1 currently retails around $50. It comes in 128GB capacity, which I think is actually quite decent. Some of the earlier generation iPod photos as well use a spinning hard drive instead of a solid state drive with no moving parts, can potentially last a little bit longer compared to a traditional hard drive, kind of like a CD player. In fact, it might be more sensitive to shock as well as vibrations. That being said, it looks like they don't have any other capacity variants available, so it's just one size fit all, and there is no micro SD card slot, interestingly enough, on the body of this player, so you can't really expand on the storage beyond the 128 gigs that it comes with. although it does come in a couple of other playful colors, including a blue, orange, and a more classy silver, as well as yellow if you prefer something more vibrant instead. Otherwise, it supports all the typical file formats from MP3s to FLAC lossless resolution tracks, and in terms of battery life, it's 1,250 milliamp hours that is rated to last around 30 hours of continuous playback, around 50% volume level using the headphone jack, which I found to be mostly true in my testing so far. However, if you're using Bluetooth with wireless headphones, expect that number to be roughly halved since the Bluetooth chip will use up more power. Otherwise, the display here measures 2.4 inches diagonally, pretty similar form factor again to a real iPod of yesteryear, and it's going to be more compact for sure compared to most modern day phones, which might be another reason to consider a dedicated player like this as backup, or perhaps you're going jogging, going to the gym, and you want to carry something more lightweight. It's obviously going to slide in more easily into a pocket or jeans. As far as packaging contents are concerned, it is rather basic, and you have access to a purple accented USB Type-C cable for both data as well as charging, and you also get a bundled pair of wire 3.5mm headphones, which actually are a slight step above most of the generic bundled headsets that we tend to see with budget MP3 players. This one actually has a braided wire, some spare silicone tips to get a more snug fit, as well as some metal accents on the outside as well. Although obviously higher end headphones with even more powerful drivers inside can further elevate the listening experience, but not bad, I would say. The hardware of the player is crafted out of polycarbonate plastic for the shell entirely, but doesn't feel too flimsy. It's a pretty solid and lightweight build overall, doesn't really flex or bend. That being said, it is one point of difference compared to real iPods, which tend to be crafted out of a aluminum or metal shell that feels perhaps a bit more premium to the touch. Very minimalistic in terms of the overall presentation. A few other controls that are missing on here compared to a real iPod would be any type of maybe hold switch for disabling the buttons, perhaps if it's in your pocket, and also there is no volume rocker similar to the actual iPod as well. So if you're adjusting volume, you have to be first playing back a song, and afterwards you're able to crank the volume higher or lower just by using the touchpad as well. That being said, in my opinion, it would have been even better to have a traditional volume rocker on the side. Maybe you want to adjust it more quickly without having to fiddle around with the touchpad to access them by feel, but it certainly is functional. Now moving into the system performance here next, overall I think they've done a decent job in terms of this music player's skin. We're able to navigate between currently playing, music mode, as well as navigate down into any videos, audiobooks, including support for bookmarking. So if you're in the middle of a longer multi-hour recording, you're able to save your spot and return to it later on. Photos, there is an FM radio function as well, which is nice, although you do have to plug in headphones to act as the antenna in that mode. And then further down below here, you can just jump into the more advanced settings. So they have kept it quite simple, maybe by purpose. There is no Wi-Fi functionality, at least in this current firmware version on the Y1, perhaps to optimize on the battery life. But if they did want to add that functionality through an update, it might unlock additional functionality like streaming music through Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Music, things like that. Compared to currently, you have to use either the FM radio or all the music is going to be stored locally on the device's memory, even if perhaps that's preferred by some folks looking at a dedicated player, perhaps in settings like workplaces or schools where phones and wireless connectivity might be not allowed due to security reasons. You can turn on shuffle as well as repeat options and also some built-in equalizers. So you can go into a classical, dance, folk, flat, hip-hop, jazz, so on and so forth. That can slightly shape the way the audio will sound. And also you're able to turn the touch tones here on and off. There is a built-in loudspeaker, by the way. It's a mono speaker and not the best in the world, but you can use it in a pinch. You can hear some of the sounds as we're navigating around the touch wheel as confirmation, but if I want to, I can turn off all of the sounds. And there's even a haptic vibration motor. It will buzz and vibrate whenever it's being turned on and off, again, similar to a smartphone there. Now, as far as the display is concerned, we're currently at around 40% there. This is the max 100%, and I would say it's decent. In most indoor conditions, it's going to be perfectly fine, but outdoors, it might produce a little bit more glare, primarily because it isn't a fully laminated screen. There's a slight air gap between the covering here, as well as the LCD underneath, but it is an IPS panel with okay viewing angles, I would say, for the most part. It gets the job done. Not a touchscreen. And then further down below here, you can go over to the theme manager. So even in the default software out of the box, you're able to choose through some other options. We can see it now looks something like this instead, in terms of the icons being a little bit more maybe flat looking, compared to this theme here called Melody. And now it will look something like this. It's a little bit more playful with some of the icons, more cartoonish if you want a more quirky looking layout, perhaps for kids to use as well. So they have put in a little bit of work in terms of the icons all changing through the different options. And this one here called Unseen is the final one that is built into the storage. It just hides all the animations from view for a more minimalist style launcher, as you can see here, with just the text details being visible. You're also able to check on system properties like storage remaining, current software version, clear the cache. That's something that is, again, much more common on a smartphone, as well as take a look at changing the system language. So it looks like English, Spanish, and Chinese are the 3 system languages which are supported. Hopefully they can add a few more in the future. That would be nice, but it looks like these are the 3 primary markets that they're selling this player in at this point in time. I do like the animations, though, of this kind of oversized text as you're scrolling through. Almost reminds me of a Zune or a Windows phone in that sense, which is quite the strange mix of iPod meets Zune, I have to say. So yeah, pretty basic, and the menu here just loops round and round if you've reached the end of the list. No real problems there. That being said, a couple of extras found on real iPods and even some of the less impressive inspired models from a few years back came with some functions like mini games to kill some time if you're in a pinch. You don't really get any of those additional games on this particular player. Additionally, there is no voice recorder functionality, which I think might have been useful as an extra. There is no microphone on this particular hardware. Now, as far as music playback is concerned, the menu here allows you to sort through artists, genres, and there's even a search functionality that is kind of replicated from iPods. You can use the scroll wheel to type in individual names of artists as well as songs to quickly search through. 3.5mm headphone jack output was quite clean. There was no real distortion or static or hissing coming out from the port, with satisfactory volume output as well. And I felt that the music quality was rather true to life, producing sufficient detail if you're pairing it with a higher resolution recording, and again, clean enough output. So of course, whether it has more bass, more treble, will depend more on the type of headphones as well as drivers or speakers that you're plugging into this thing, but generally speaking, I found it to be a pretty smooth and comfortable listening experience. That being said, on a more technical note, they don't really necessarily tout the specific chip, aka the DAC or digital to analog converter inside, and so I suspect it's going to be more of an entry-level DAC chip versus the more audiophile-centric music players which are perhaps hi-fi certified from brands like Sony. Some of their Walkman players tend to be significantly more expensive, and even some of the other rivals like Fio, Cohen, Shangling, just as a couple of examples. But I would argue that the difference is really only perceivable to true audiophiles if you're listening extremely closely and comparing them side by side, but I still found myself enjoying the music experience coming out of this player. No real complaints there. So for something that is so thin and lightweight, I guess it's not bad in terms of volume output, but obviously it's not as rich or going to be as impressive in terms of detail compared to the headphone jack, but it is there as a backup, which is at least nice, I guess, compared to some of the other players like iPod Nanos have sometimes omitted a built-in speaker. Here's also next to something like a Zune HD, touchscreen player just to serve as reference, so you get the idea. Pretty nostalgic in terms of the form factor at the very least. Here it is playing back some other quick video clips just to serve as a reference, so you are able to play back MP4s, also if you want to use this in the pinch, but obviously the screen size here is much smaller than any modern day phone, although it's not unsurprising that it's able to play back these video clips, considering it is again running on Android, and really any modern day smartphone is capable of playing back video clips just fine. So that is more or less it as far as our hands-on review of this Innioasis Y1 DAP or digital audio player. Again, it is perhaps the best iPod Classic inspired or styled player that I've seen yet in terms of having a real functioning scroll wheel, which was never the case in the past. Also being quite good in terms of file format support, since it is technically running on a more advanced operating system. So if you like the aesthetics of the iPods of yesteryear and you're looking for just a newer unit with a brand new battery, more modernized components, support for Bluetooth, this might be interesting to consider. That being said, a couple of caveats is if you are flashing it to Rockbox OS for even more skins like the Windows 95 or iPod inspired themes, keep in mind that the Rockbox Linux-based OS does not support Bluetooth connectivity at this point in time because it was written for primarily older generation music players from the 2000s. And so if you wanted to preserve the Bluetooth functionality connecting to wireless headphones, my recommendation would actually just be sticking with the current Android-based OS or software that it comes with. However, if you're okay with using it as a wired-only MP3 player, then you can definitely consider that for additional customization if you're into the DIY software community. That being said, with Rockbox, you are able to install a dual boot version of the OS, similar to on iPods as well, that still preserves the original operating system. So when you first boot it up, you can quickly jump between either Rockbox or the normal operating system, switching between them on the fly, just taking up a little bit more storage space on the built-in memory. So you don't have to necessarily wipe or completely remove the original OS, granting you a little bit more flexibility. As a sub $50 player, this also might be a little bit more affordable than some of the classic iPods, which have since become more like collector's items if they're in functioning condition, perhaps makes it a slightly more affordable option. You can learn more details if you're interested in the links down below, but for now that's been our video. Thanks for watching here at OS Reviews. That has been a closer look at the Innioasis Y1 touchpad or scroll wheel enabled MP3 player.